Sarah Matthews stared at the growing pile of credit card statements spread across her home office desk. Her hands trembled as she flipped through page after page of unexplained charges. At 34, she had always been the responsible one, carefully planning every financial decision since her first job as an accountant 7 years ago. But her husband Robert's recent behavior had thrown their once stable life into chaos. The Sunday afternoon sunlight streamed through the window as she calculated the totals for the third time. The numbers didn't lie. Robert had spent over $12,000 in the past month alone. Sarah pushed back her dark hair, trying to make sense of the charges. There were multiple ATM withdrawals, online purchases from gambling websites, and transactions at local casinos that she never knew he visited. Their story had started so differently. 5 years ago, Robert had been the picture of financial responsibility. He worked as a successful sales manager at an automotive dealership, always bringing home consistent commissions. They had met at a mutual friend's barbecue, where Robert's charm and warm smile had instantly caught Sarah's attention. Their courtship had been a whirlwind of romantic dates, thoughtful gestures, and shared dreams of building a future together. The first 2 years of marriage had been everything Sarah had hoped for. They bought a modest 3-bedroom house in a quiet suburb, planted a garden together, and even started saving for eventual children. Robert surprised her with small gifts, weekend getaways, and random acts of kindness that made her fall more in love with him each day. But things began to change about a year ago. It started small, Robert coming home later than usual, being distracted during dinner conversations, and making excuses to spend time alone with his phone. Sarah noticed him becoming increasingly secretive about his spending habits. When she asked questions, he would deflect with vague answers or change the subject entirely. The transformation in his personality was subtle but steady. The warm, engaging man she married was slowly being replaced by someone she barely recognized. Robert's eyes had lost their sparkle, replaced by a constant nervous energy. He stopped joining her for their regular Sunday brunches with friends, claiming he needed to catch up on work. His once pristine appearance became neglected, with wrinkled clothes and dark circles under his eyes becoming his new normal. Sarah's colleague Janet had noticed the changes too. During their lunch breaks, Janet would give her concerned looks as Sarah made excuses for Robert's increasingly erratic behavior. "Marriage takes work," Sarah would say, trying to convince herself more than anyone else. But deep down, she knew something was seriously wrong. Last week, she had discovered the first concrete evidence of trouble. While cleaning their home office, she found a stack of past due notices hidden behind the filing cabinet. The sight of those red-stamped envelopes made her stomach churn. Robert had always handled their joint investments and major financial decisions, claiming his sales background made him better suited for it. Now she wondered if that too had been part of a carefully constructed facade. As Sarah organized the latest batch of statements, a notification popped up on her phone. Another charge had just been made to their joint credit card. $500 at an online gambling site. Her heart sank. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was about trust, respect, and the future of their marriage. The house felt unusually quiet as she sat there, the only sound being the gentle hum of the air conditioning and the occasional rustle of paper. Through the window, she could see their neighbors' children playing in their yard, their laughter a stark contrast to the heavy atmosphere in her own home. The garden she and Robert had planted together was now overgrown with weeds, another small but telling sign of how their lives had unraveled. Sarah knew she needed to take action, but fear kept her frozen in place. What would confronting Robert accomplish? Would he deny everything? Get angry? Promise to change? She had seen glimpses of a temper she never knew he possessed, usually when she questioned his spending or whereabouts. The sound of a car door slamming snapped her out of her thoughts. Robert was home early from his Sunday work meeting. Sarah quickly gathered the statements, hiding them in her personal drawer. As she heard his keys in the front door, she took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and prepared herself for another evening of pretending everything was fine. But deep down, she knew that tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow, she would have to face the truth about her husband and their crumbling marriage. Monday morning arrived with a harsh reality that Sarah couldn't ignore any longer. While Robert slept, she quietly made her way to their shared home office computer. Her hands shook as she opened their online banking portal, dreading what she might find. The screen revealed the devastating truth: their joint savings account, which had once held $45,000 for their future home renovation, now showed a balance of just $3,200. Sarah's mind raced back to all the times Robert had assured her their finances were under control. She thought about the investment opportunities he had mentioned, the business ventures he claimed would double their money. Now she understood. These were all lies to cover his gambling addiction. The early morning silence was broken by the sound of Robert stirring upstairs. Sarah quickly closed the browser and pretended to be making coffee when he entered the kitchen. His appearance shocked her. His face was pale, his clothes from yesterday were wrinkled, and his eyes had a haunted look she'd never seen before. "Good morning," she said softly, studying his reaction. Robert barely acknowledged her, heading straight for his phone. Sarah watched as his fingers frantically tapped the screen, his expression growing more desperate by the second. She knew he was probably checking his gambling accounts or looking for ways to place more bets. "Robert," she began, gathering her courage, "we need to talk about our finances." The moment the words left her mouth, she saw his body tense. He didn't look up from his phone, but his knuckles turned white from gripping it too hard. "Not now, Sarah. I got everything under control," he snapped, his voice carrying an edge that made her flinch. "I'm expecting a big win today. It'll fix everything." Sarah took a deep breath. "I saw our savings account, Robert. The renovation money is almost gone. What happened to it?" She tried to keep her voice steady, but fear and anger made it tremble. Robert's reaction was immediate and frightening. He slammed his phone down on the kitchen counter, making Sarah jump. "You had no right to check that. I told you I'm handling our finances." His face had turned red, and a vein pulsed in his forehead. "I have every right," Sarah replied, surprised by the strength in her voice. "That was our money, our future. You've been gambling it away, haven't you?" The silence that followed her question was deafening. Robert's expression shifted from anger to something else, shame, perhaps, or desperation. For a moment, Sarah saw a glimpse of the man she had married, vulnerable, and lost. But that moment passed quickly. "You don't understand," he muttered, pacing the kitchen like a caged animal. "I'm so close to a big win. Just one more game, one more bet, and I'll win it all back. I just need some more cash to make it happen." Sarah's heart sank as she realized how deep his addiction ran. The man she loved was trapped in a cycle of lies and desperate gambles, and she had been enabling it by staying silent for too long. With trembling hands, she reached into her purse and pulled out a small stack of papers. "I went to the bank last week," she said quietly. "I've opened a separate account in my name only. I'm moving my salary there from now on." Robert froze mid-pace. "What did you say?" His voice was dangerously low. "I also applied for a new credit card, just in my name," Sarah continued, forcing herself to meet his increasingly angry gaze. "I won't let you destroy everything we built together, Robert. You need help." She watched as various emotions flickered across his face: betrayal, anger, fear, and something darker she couldn't quite identify. The Robert she knew and loved seemed to disappear entirely, replaced by someone she barely recognized. "Where is it?" he demanded, stepping closer to her. "Give me the new credit card, Sarah, now." Sarah backed away, clutching her purse tighter. "No, Robert, this has to stop. We can get you help. Find a counselor who specializes in gambling addiction." He cut her off with a harsh laugh that sent chills down her spine. "Help? I don't need help. What I need is my wife to stop interfering and trust me to handle things." As the morning sun streamed through their kitchen window, Sarah realized this confrontation was far from over. The look in Robert's eyes told her that things were about to get much worse. The kitchen felt smaller than ever as Robert loomed over Sarah, his breathing heavy and erratic. The morning had barely begun, but tension filled the air like a thick fog. The coffee maker beeped in the background, signaling that the fresh pot was ready, but neither of them moved to get it. "I'll ask you one more time," Robert said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Where is the credit card?" His hands were shaking, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool morning air. Sarah clutched her purse closer to her chest, taking another step back until she felt the kitchen counter press against her spine. "No, Robert. You're not thinking clearly. Look at yourself. When was the last time you really slept? When was the last time you went a day without gambling?" Her words seemed to hit something raw inside him. Robert's face contorted with a mix of shame and rage. He grabbed his coffee mug from the counter, his knuckles white around the handle. The steam rose from the dark liquid, swirling in the space between them like a warning signal Sarah failed to notice. "You don't understand," he spat out. "I'm so close to winning big. The system I've worked out, it's foolproof. I just need a little more cash to make it work." His eyes had a wild, desperate look that Sarah had never seen before, not even during their worst arguments. Sarah tried to reason with him one last time. "Robert, please. Listen to yourself. This isn't you. The gambling has changed you. What happened to our dreams? The house renovation? Starting a family?" Her voice cracked on the last word, memories of their past conversations about children flooding back. For a brief moment, something flickered in Robert's eyes. A flash of recognition, perhaps even regret. But it vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a cold determination that made Sarah's blood run cold. "Last chance," he growled. "Give me the card, or you'll regret it." Sarah straightened her spine, finding strength she didn't know she had. "No, I won't help you destroy yourself anymore. We need to get you help, Robert. Professional help." What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Robert's face twisted into an unrecognizable mask of fury. Without warning, he raised the coffee mug above his head. Sarah's eyes widened as she realized what was about to happen, but her body felt frozen in place. The hot coffee arsed through the air, steam trailing behind it like a malicious comet. Sarah felt the scorching liquid hit her chest and shoulders, soaking through her thin blouse. The pain was immediate and intense, drawing a scream from her throat that echoed through the house. The empty mug clattered to the floor, rolling under the kitchen table as Sarah doubled over in agony. The hot coffee burned her skin, leaving angry red marks wherever it touched. Through tears of pain, she saw Robert standing there, his face a mixture of shock and horror at what he'd just done. "Oh God," he whispered, taking a step toward her. "Sarah, I didn't mean to." "Stay away from me," she screamed, stumbling backward toward the kitchen door. Her blouse clung to her burned skin, intensifying the pain with every movement. The sound of a door opening made them both freeze. "Sarah, is everything okay?" I heard screaming. It was their neighbor, Mrs. Chen, calling from the front porch. The elderly woman had always kept a watchful eye on their house, and today her concern might have been a lifeline. Robert's expression changed again, panic replacing the horror as he realized what this meant. Sarah saw her chance and took it, running toward the front door despite the searing pain across her chest and shoulders. "Help," she cried out, her voice breaking. "Please call the police." Behind her, she heard Robert's heavy footsteps, then the sound of him rushing up the stairs, probably to grab his keys and wallet. Sarah reached the front door just as Mrs. Chen was about to knock, nearly colliding with the startled woman. "Oh my God, you're hurt," Mrs. Chen exclaimed, already pulling out her phone. "What happened?" As Sarah collapsed into her neighbor's arms, she heard Robert's car engine roar to life in the garage. The sound of screeching tires told her he was fleeing, but it didn't matter anymore. The damage was done, and there would be no going back to the way things were. The emergency room buzzed with activity as nurses rushed to treat Sarah's burns. Mrs. Chen sat nearby, her weathered hands clutching her phone as she spoke with the police for the third time. The harsh fluorescent lights made the angry red burns on Sarah's skin look even more severe. "Second-degree burns," the doctor explained, carefully applying medicated cream to Sarah's chest and shoulders. "You'll need to keep these bandaged and come back for regular checkups. We're also going to give you something for the pain." He paused, his kind eyes meeting hers. "The police will want to take photos for evidence. Are you okay with that?" Sarah nodded numbly. The initial shock had worn off, replaced by a deep, throbbing pain that seemed to pulse with each heartbeat. The hospital gown they'd given her felt rough against her sensitive skin, a constant reminder of what Robert had done. Two police officers waited patiently outside the examination room. Officer Martinez, a woman with gentle eyes and a firm voice, had been especially supportive since arriving at the scene. Her partner, Officer Thompson, had already taken Mrs. Chen's statement and was coordinating with other units to locate Robert. "Mrs. Matthews," Officer Martinez said softly, entering the room after the doctor finished the initial treatment. "I know this is difficult, but we need to get your statement while the details are still fresh. Can you tell me exactly what happened this morning?" Sarah's voice trembled as she recounted the events, discovering the gambling, the confrontation over the credit card, the moment Robert snapped. As she spoke, tears rolled down her cheeks, not just from the physical pain, but from the realization that her marriage had completely unraveled. "He's never been violent before," Sarah whispered, then corrected herself. "At least, not physically. But lately, his moods, his behavior, was like living with a stranger." Officer Martinez nodded sympathetically while taking notes. "We've put out an alert for his vehicle. Has he contacted you since he left?" Sarah shook her head, then remembered something. "My phone, it's still in my purse at home. I couldn't grab anything when I ran out." "Officer Thompson will accompany you home to collect your essential items once you're cleared by the medical team," Officer Martinez assured her. "But we don't recommend staying there tonight. Do you have somewhere safe you can go?" The question hit Sarah hard. Where could she go? Their families lived in different states, and she gradually lost touch with many friends over the past year as Robert's gambling addiction had isolated them. Mrs. Chen, who had been quietly listening, stepped forward. "She can stay with me," the elderly woman offered firmly. "I have a spare bedroom, and I can help keep an eye on her burns." Fresh tears welled up in Sarah's eyes at her neighbor's kindness. All those mornings of friendly waves and brief chats over the fence had created a stronger bond than she'd realized. The police officers exchanged looks of approval. "That would be ideal for now," Officer Martinez said. "We'll need to process your house as a crime scene, and we'll post additional patrols in the neighborhood in case Robert returns." A nurse entered with paperwork and prescription forms, explaining the care instructions for the burns. Sarah tried to focus on the medical information, but her mind kept replaying the morning's events. The look in Robert's eyes just before he threw the coffee, it wasn't just anger she'd seen. There had been desperation, fear, and something else, something broken. "The domestic violence counselor will be here shortly," Officer Martinez added gently. "She can help you understand your options and assist with getting a restraining order." A restraining order. The words felt surreal. Just yesterday, she had been making dinner in their kitchen, still holding on to hope that she could somehow help Robert overcome his addiction. Now she sat in an emergency room, burned and betrayed, preparing to legally bar her husband from coming near her. Mrs. Chen reached out and patted Sarah's hand, careful to avoid the areas where the burns extended down her arm. "One step at a time, dear," she said softly, "one step at a time." Sarah nodded, watching as the nurse changed her bandages. Each layer of gauze felt like another layer of reality settling in. Her marriage was over, her sense of safety shattered, but somehow, she would have to find the strength to move forward. As the pain medication began to take effect, Sarah closed her eyes, wondering how she would ever trust anyone again. 3 days passed in Mrs. Chen's spare bedroom, where Sarah struggled to find comfort with her bandaged burns. Each movement brought sharp reminders of that terrible morning, and sleep came only in short, restless bursts. The police had called twice. Robert's car had been spotted at various locations, but he remained elusive. On the fourth morning, Sarah sat at Mrs. Chen's kitchen table, attempting to eat the soup her neighbor had prepared. The elderly woman had become not just a caretaker but a source of quiet strength, never pushing Sarah to talk but always ready to listen when she needed to. "Your phone has been buzzing," Mrs. Chen said softly, placing the device on the table. The police had retrieved it from Sarah's house along with some essential items. "He's been calling." Sarah stared at the screen. 15 missed calls from Robert in the past hour alone. As she watched, a text message appeared. "Please, Sarah, I need to explain. Meet me at Cooper's Diner at noon. I'm desperate." Her hands trembled as she showed the message to Mrs. Chen. "He knows I used to get lunch there sometimes," Sarah explained, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's just 2 blocks from my office." Mrs. Chen's face creased with concern. "You're not thinking of going, are you? The restraining order has been filed but not served yet," Sarah finished. "They still haven't found him to deliver it." She touched her bandaged shoulder gently, wincing at the contact. Maybe if I meet him in public." "No." Mrs. Chen's voice was firmer than Sarah had ever heard it. "I watched my sister make that mistake 30 years ago. Her husband's explanation put her in the hospital for a week." Before Sarah could respond, her phone buzzed again. This time it was Officer Martinez. "Mrs. Matthews, we've received information that Robert has been trying to contact you. Under no circumstances should you agree to meet him." We have reason to believe he's become increasingly unstable. Sarah put the phone on speaker as Officer Martinez continued. We found evidence that he's taken out high-interest loans from some dangerous people. His gambling debts are much worse than initially thought. He's not just running from us, he's running from them too. The news hit Sarah like a physical blow. She thought she had uncovered the full extent of Robert's addiction, but this revelation opened new depths of deception. Her soup grew cold as Officer Martinez explained that they'd discovered links to illegal gambling operations and loan sharks. What happens when they find him? Sarah asked, her voice shaking. That's why we need to find him first, Officer Martinez replied. For his safety and yours. These aren't people who take unpaid debts lightly. After ending the call, Sarah sat in silence, processing this new information. Her phone buzzed again, another text from Robert. If you ever love me, please come. I have nowhere else to turn. Mrs. Chen gently took the phone from Sarah's trembling hands. Let me tell you something, she said, sitting down beside her. When my sister finally left her husband, he sent messages just like these. He knew exactly what to say to pull at her heart. Abusers always do. Robert's not. Sarah started to protest, then stopped. Wasn't he? The coffee incident wasn't just a moment of lost control. It was the culmination of months of emotional manipulation and financial abuse. The man you love doesn't exist anymore, Mrs. Chen continued softly. The gambling and desperation have changed him into someone else, someone dangerous. As if to emphasize her point, Sarah's phone lit up with another message. If you don't come, I'll have nothing left to lose. Whatever happens will be your fault. The threat lay bare on the screen, destroying any lingering doubt about meeting him. Sarah felt a chill run through her body despite the warm kitchen. Mrs. Chen was right. The Robert who had once brought her flowers and planned their future together was gone. In his place was a desperate man willing to hurt the person he had promised to love and protect. I should call Officer Martinez back, Sarah said, her voice stronger now. They need to know about these threats. As she reached for the phone, Sarah felt something shift inside her, fear giving way to determination. She couldn't help Robert anymore. She could only help herself. The burns on her shoulders still hurt, but they were also healing, just as she would heal, one day at a time. A week after the coffee incident, Sarah sat in the police station's interview room, staring at the photos Officer Martinez had laid out on the table. They showed Robert using various ATMs across 3 different states, looking increasingly disheveled with each image. The timestamp on the most recent photo was from just 6 hours ago. He's getting careless, Officer Martinez explained, pointing to the last photo. He's using your joint account card, even though it's been flagged. He seems to be moving south, possibly heading toward Mexico. Sarah studied Robert's face in the latest image. His eyes were wild, his clothes wrinkled, and his usually well-maintained hair was unkempt. She barely recognized the man she had married 5 years ago. There's more, Officer Thompson added, entering the room with a thick file. We've uncovered connections to an illegal gambling ring operating out of basement clubs. Robert owes them over $150,000. That's on top of the legal gambling debts we already knew about. Sarah felt the room spin slightly. How could he hide so much? She whispered, more to herself than the officers. Just then, Sarah's phone lit up with a notification. She had changed her number, but Robert had somehow gotten the new one. The message made her blood run cold. They're coming for me. I need money. If you don't help me, they'll come for you too. Officer Martinez quickly documented the message while Officer Thompson made some calls. The station buzzed with renewed activity as they tracked the source of the text. Mrs. Matthews, a new voice called from the doorway. A man in a dark suit entered, showing his FBI credentials. I'm Agent Carson. We've been monitoring the gambling ring your husband was involved with. His threats against you have elevated this case to our jurisdiction. Sarah listened as Agent Carson explained how Robert had become entangled with a notorious criminal organization. They used gambling addiction to trap people, forcing them into increasingly desperate situations. Robert wasn't just their victim, he had started recruiting others, promising them ways to win big and escape their debts. The coffee incident, Agent Carson said carefully, might have been a blessing in disguise. It exposed everything before you could be drawn further into his schemes. Some spouses end up unknowingly involved in money laundering or worse. As they talked, another officer rushed in with news. They had located Robert at a motel just outside of town. He had used Sarah's new credit card number, the one he had been so desperate to get, to book the room. "But I never gave him that number," Sarah said, confused. Agent Carson's expression darkened. "He must have had someone hack your information. This organization has quite sophisticated cyber capabilities." The next hour passed in a blur of activity. SWAT teams were mobilized, positions coordinated, and Sarah was moved to a secure room within the station. Through it all, she felt strangely calm, as if watching events unfold in a movie rather than her real life. Officer Martinez stayed with her, providing updates as they came in. "They've surrounded the motel," she reported. "Robert's alone in the room. They're trying to negotiate." Sarah's phone buzzed one final time. "I'm sorry, Sarah. I never meant for any of this to happen. I love you." Before she could process the message, shouts erupted from the police radio. Robert had tried to escape through the motel window. In his desperate attempt to flee, he had fallen from the second floor. "He's alive," Officer Martinez assured her quickly, "but injured. They're taking him to the hospital under guard." Sarah sat in silence, emotions washing over her in waves. Relief that it was over. Sadness for the man she had loved. Anger at his betrayal. Fear of the unknown future ahead. Agent Carson returned an hour later with more details. They had found evidence in Robert's motel room linking him to dozens of illegal gambling operations. There were notebooks full of names, amounts, and threats. He had been in deeper than anyone had suspected. "You'll need to testify," Agent Carson explained gently. "But given the circumstances and the evidence we've gathered, you're clearly a victim in all this. We'll make sure you're protected." Sarah nodded, touching her healing burns through her shirt. The physical wounds would soon fade, but she knew the emotional scars would take much longer to heal. Still, for the first time since that horrible morning in her kitchen, she felt something close to peace. The nightmare was finally ending. The courtroom was packed when Sarah took the witness stand 3 months later. Her burns had healed, leaving faint scars that served as permanent reminders of that fateful morning. Robert sat at the defendant's table, wearing an orange jumpsuit and a back brace from his motel fall, avoiding eye contact with her. "Please state your name for the record," the prosecutor, Ms. Reynolds, requested. "Sarah Elizabeth Matthews," she replied, her voice stronger than she expected. The past 3 months had changed her in ways she was only beginning to understand. As Sarah testified about the years of financial deception, the gambling addiction, and finally the violent coffee incident, she noticed how different Robert looked. The confident sales manager she had married was gone, replaced by a hollow-eyed man who seemed to have aged a decade in just a few months. "Mrs. Matthews," Ms. Reynolds continued, "please tell the court about the financial impact of the defendant's actions." Sarah described discovering the emptied accounts, the massive gambling debts, and the loans from dangerous criminals. The jury listened intently as she explained how Robert had nearly destroyed not just their marriage, but their entire lives. The total amount, Sarah stated, consulting the documents in front of her, was $487,000. "Our house is in foreclosure, our retirement accounts are empty, and I'm still paying off the credit cards he maxed out." Robert's defense attorney, a court-appointed lawyer named Mr. Stevens, tried to paint the incident as a one-time loss of control triggered by addiction, but the evidence was overwhelming. The prosecution presented hundreds of threatening text messages, surveillance footage from illegal gambling dens, and testimony from other victims Robert had recruited into the gambling ring. During a break in the proceedings, Sarah sat in the courthouse hallway with Mrs. Chen, who hadn't missed a single day of the trial. The elderly woman had become more than a neighbor. She was family now. "You're doing well," Mrs. Chen assured her, passing her a bottle of water. "Just tell the truth. That's all you need to do." When court resumed, Robert's attorney called him to testify. For the first time since that morning in their kitchen, Sarah heard his voice directly addressed to her. "Sarah, I'm so sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "The gambling. It took over everything. I couldn't think straight. I couldn't see what I was doing to us, to you. When he tried to stop me that morning, I lost control." The prosecutor objected to his direct address to Sarah, and the judge instructed Robert to direct his testimony to the court. But Sarah had seen what she needed to see in his eyes. genuine remorse mixed with something else, the desperate need of an addict who still hadn't fully confronted his demons. Agent Carson testified next, revealing the full scope of the gambling ring Robert had become involved with. The organization had been using Robert and others like him to recruit new victims, creating a pyramid scheme of destruction that had affected hundreds of families. The defendant wasn't just a victim of gambling addiction, Agent Carson explained. He became an active participant in destroying other people's lives. As the trial neared its end, Sarah's victim impact statement became the final piece of testimony. She stood at the podium, looking directly at the jury rather than at Robert. "I lost my husband long before he poured that coffee on me," she said steadily. "The man I married disappeared into casinos and online betting sites, replaced by someone I didn't recognize. The burns will heal, but the trust he destroyed, in him, in marriage, in people, that will take much longer to repair." When the jury left to deliberate, Sarah waited with Mrs. Chen and Officer Martinez, who had become a close friend through the ordeal. They didn't have to wait long. After just 4 hours, the jury returned with their verdict. "We, the jury, find the defendant guilty on all counts," the foreman announced. Robert's shoulders slumped as the judge prepared to announce the sentence. Sarah felt no joy in his defeat, only a profound sadness for the life they had lost and the future they would never have. As she left the courthouse that evening, Sarah realized this wasn't just the end of her marriage. It was the beginning of her recovery. The path ahead would be difficult, but for the first time in years, she was walking it on her own terms. 1 year after the trial, Sarah stood before a group of women at the local community center. The small meeting room was filled with people who shared similar stories of domestic abuse and financial manipulation. As the founder of Phoenix Rising, a support group for survivors of financial abuse, Sarah had found her calling in helping others rebuild their lives. "I used to think I was alone," she began, her confidence evident in her steady voice. "I thought I was the only one who didn't see the signs until it was too late. But standing here today, I know that's not true." The scars on her shoulders had faded to pale marks, barely visible unless you knew where to look. Like those physical scars, the emotional wounds had begun to heal, though they still served as reminders of how far she had come. Robert was serving 8 years in federal prison, with additional time for his role in the gambling ring. The last Sarah had heard, he was finally getting the addiction treatment he needed. She had received one letter from him 6 months ago, which remained unopened in her desk drawer. Some doors were better left closed. Mrs. Chen sat in the back of the room, beaming with pride. The elderly woman had not only given Sarah shelter during her darkest days, but had also helped her start the support group by connecting her with other survivors in the community. Their bond had grown stronger with each passing month. "Financial abuse often goes unnoticed," Sarah continued, sharing the wisdom she had gained. "It starts small, a hidden purchase, a secret account, a lie about money. By the time it escalates to violence, the victim is often trapped in a web of debt and fear." Officer Martinez, now a close friend, had helped Sarah develop a program with the local police department to train officers in recognizing signs of financial abuse. Their work had already helped several women escape dangerous situations before they turned violent. Sarah's professional life had also transformed. After the trial, she had started her own accounting firm specializing in helping abuse survivors rebuild their financial lives. Her experience had given her unique insight into the challenges these women faced. "Today, I want to share something with you," Sarah announced to the group. "Phoenix Rising has received a grant to open a transitional housing facility. We'll be able to provide safe housing for women leaving abusive situations while they get back on their feet." The room erupted in applause. Sarah smiled, remembering how Mrs. Chen's spare bedroom had been her own transitional housing just a year ago. Now she could offer that same lifeline to others. After the meeting, Sarah walked home with Mrs. Chen, enjoying the spring evening. Her new apartment was just a few blocks from her elderly friend, in a neighborhood where she felt safe and supported. "You've done so much in just 1 year," Mrs. Chen remarked proudly. "From victim to survivor to leader. It's quite a journey." Sarah nodded, thinking about the frightened woman she had been, standing in her kitchen that morning as hot coffee burned her skin. "I couldn't have done it without you," she replied. "Without any of you." That evening, as Sarah sat in her small but cozy living room, she opened her laptop to review applications for Phoenix Rising's housing program. Each story she read reminded her of her own journey, but also of the strength that could emerge from trauma. Her phone buzzed with a text from Agent Carson. "Thought you want to know. The gambling ring case is finally closed. Your testimony helped put away the entire organization. You've saved countless families from going through what you did." Sarah smiled, feeling a sense of closure. The organization that had helped destroy her marriage was finished, and she had played a part in making that happen. It felt like justice, not just for her, but for all the other victims. As she prepared for bed that night, Sarah caught her reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back at her was different from the one who had once shared a home with Robert. She was stronger, wiser, and most importantly, at peace with her past. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, more survivors to help, more stories to hear, more lives to rebuild. But Sarah was ready for them all. She had learned that sometimes the worst moments in life could lead to the most meaningful transformations. The coffee burns had left their marks, but they had also forged her into someone who could help others find their way out of the darkness. Sarah turned off the lights, knowing that her story wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about thriving, about turning pain into purpose, and about building a future she could be proud of.